Hi, you all. So in the last video, I talked about herd immunity and vaccination. Today, I want to talk about other approaches to reducing the severity of an epidemic. I will talk more closely about our current situation than I have been. I will also be sharing some sites with you where you can look at further simulations and at least one of them play around with some of the parameters that I'll be talking about in a great deal more detail if you are curious. This will be the last video of the semester, so I also want to just take this moment to say thank you all. It's been a semester to remember, and I hope one that we never have to repeat again, and good luck and take care of yourselves. Okay, let me get the slides up. There we go. So I want to talk about other ways of lowering R, or not, that reproductive number. So I'm going to look at what's called mitigation. And our main point here is that herd immunity is not our only option. We don't want an epidemic to spread enough to achieve herd immunity, at least in this COVID case. That's the whole point, to flatten the curve. COVID has an R0 of probably somewhere between 2.5 and 4. It's really entirely unclear at this point, and certainly it depends on the circumstance and the environment. So let's say an R0 of 3.5. That would mean we'd only get herd immunity after something like 70% of the population was infected. That's over 200 million infections in the United States. And depending on the infection fatality rate, which is still unclear right now, probably over 4 million deaths. That's 100 times what we have right now, probably worse than that because we would have a hopelessly overloaded medical system and so on and so forth. We all heard about this in the conversation around flatten the curve. So how else do we slow down an epidemic? And of course, this is something we're all living through, but I want to talk about it and hopefully end on a somewhat realistic but optimistic note and look at what alternatives are to the extreme social distancing that we've all been living through for the last couple of months, excuse me. So R0, our basic reproductive number, we can think of it as being made up of 3 separate components. You want to take the number of contacts you have per day, that is the number of people that a sick person comes into contact with in a situation which might spread that virus, times the chance of spreading the disease when somebody is exposed. Every time a sick person comes into contact with a healthy person, that healthy person does not necessarily catch the disease. Then we need to multiply that by the number of days somebody is contagious and spreading the disease. So we have these 3 different components, and very simply, you can multiply them together to give you R0. And again, these are not absolute specific detailed numbers. You cannot calculate these values exactly for any virus. They vary with the person, they vary with the situation, but we can get an idea of the sorts of ranges of what's appropriate and something. Well, and they can give us some ideas, and it's helpful because we can break down what we might want to do to mitigate a disease into ways to affect these 3 different components. So I said reducing any one of these factors should lower R0. So at the moment, we're living through shelter in place. So if we had an R0 of 3.5 before mitigation, here's one approximation for the sorts of things we might have done. On average, maybe somebody has 70% fewer contacts per day than they did before. Many people are not working, schools are not in session, some people still are. So again, as with everything we've been talking about, that is going to be an average of very different numbers for very different people. Perhaps we've reduced the chance of spreading the disease by about 5% from hand washing and disinfecting and the other various increases in hygiene that we've seen. And let's say 20% of contagious people are isolating themselves, maybe because they know they came into contact with somebody who had the virus. Perhaps they got tested. Perhaps they just recognized that they had the symptoms. So they're isolating themselves at some point, not the instant they're contagious, because one of the problems with COVID is it seems to be contagious before people have symptoms, but maybe they're cutting in half the amount of time they spread the virus, the number of days they are contagious. So that would mean 20% of people having the time they spread the virus, so 10% fewer days people are spreading the disease, again, on average. So our new R naught is this original 3.5, but then only 30% as many contacts, 95% of the previous chance of spreading the disease, that's taking into account hand washing, and 90% of the number of contagious days. So if you multiply all those together, you get a new R value of 0.9. So yay, R naught is less than 1. Again, this is under this incredibly extreme shelter-in-place environment. I have seen estimates for R naughts in the various states right now that range from about 0.7 to 0.9 or 0.95. So this is, if anything, it's perhaps a slightly conservative estimate of where we are right now. So you got to be careful, because the advantage to herd immunity, that previous slide, is you don't have to do anything to maintain it. It keeps R low long term, as long as there are those immunities in the population, and there are concerns about immunities wearing off. We're not going to think about that. Mitigation, the sorts of steps we're taking, do lower R naught, but if you stop those mitigation techniques, R naught goes right back up. If we all suddenly went out in giant crowds and sporting events and on all bars and all that sort of thing, then R naught would go right back up to 3.5, and the epidemic would pick up again, and you would get a second wave. And we've seen this, we saw this in the 1918 flu epidemic, where there was a first wave that was very scary and people shut everything down and they were very careful. Plus flu has a heavy seasonal component, stronger than we think COVID does. So it died out throughout the summer. And then the next fall, unfortunately, people had gotten back to normal. This is data from the UK, and it picked up far more extremely than it had the year before, and there was even a third wave after that. So epidemic picks up, people start shutting down, R goes below 1, people relax their mitigation, it goes right back up again. Of course, in 1918, we didn't understand a lot of this. We only really barely had a grasp on the whole germ theory of disease at that point. So we know a lot more now, and the hope is to avoid this second wave. So just by the way, here's one news story about Italy preparing for a possible such second wave. Italy had this awful outbreak. It's been getting better. It's calming down. They're not easing off. They're in fact stocking up on ventilators right now, just in case the damn thing comes back again. So what do we do? Because we can't shelter in place forever, right? We can't keep the current situation going on. So I'd like you to think a little bit about what other steps we could take other than reducing social contacts to reduce R naught. Certainly, going forward for the next year or so, we are going to see some reductions in social contacts, but not this extreme version. So we're going to need other steps to add to this or multiply to this. So I'd like you to take a moment to give me your thoughts about that on the form. So let's start with a much more modest 25% reduction in social contacts, mostly no big groups, no sporting events, no reducing crowding in bars and restaurants, businesses in general, all the sort of thing that people have been talking about. So if that reduces the number of people a sick person comes into contact by 25%, there are 75% as many contacts, that gets our R naught down to 2.6, which is still way too high. So we need to start looking at other forms of mitigation. There's reducing the number of contacts. There's reducing the chance of spreading the disease. Okay, we're not going to let up on all that hand washing and disinfecting surfaces. I just read that for the first time in decades at least, the New York subway is not going to be running 24 hours. They're shutting it down for 4 hours, I think from 1 to 5 in the morning, in order to disinfect it. So this disinfecting is going to keep up, so that, again, let's say, and I'm not saying any of these numbers are exactly correct, but let's say that reduces your chance of spreading the disease by 5%. And I'm intentionally being a little bit conservative there. So that's going to get our R naught value down to 2.5. And Because this is exponential growth, every reduction helps, but 2.5 is still far bigger than we want. So what else? Masks. Places are starting to require mask wearing. And this is going to be an intervention which I expect will be in case for a long time and really seems like a major change. So a mask makes you less likely to catch the virus. Let's say the sorts of handmade masks, fabric masks that we have, and again, I'm being conservative here, only reduce you, a healthy person's chance of catching the virus from a sick person by 20%. So if there's a sort of 20% reduction, you're now 80% as likely to catch it as you were before. So again, these multiply. So each reduction, 20% reduction doesn't sound that much. 5% reduction from hygiene and hand washing sounds tiny, but they multiply. So masks making a healthy person less likely to catch the virus, that's bringing our R value down to 2.0. Masks are actually better than that because they also mean a sick person or an asymptomatic person who is contagious is less likely to spread the virus. And a lot of the data that's out there suggests that this is actually the more protective effort of masks. I am crediting masks right here as reducing the chance of spreading the virus by 40%. Some of the data that I have seen suggests that if we wear masks universally, it's probably even larger than that. And this is a slogan that I expect you've heard: my mask protects you, your mask protects me. So we're all wearing masks to protect one another. So at this point, if we multiply all of these together, we're getting our R naught down to 1.2. Again, I'm not saying these numbers are the exact truth, but they give you the idea. Each one of these interventions seem kind of weak on its own. The reduction in social contacts, only 25%. The masks, not that effective. But as we start stacking them, we're getting close to that R naught value that we want to get to. We're still not there yet. So what else do we have? We have contact tracing and testing. As we ramp up testing people, and the idea of contact tracing is if somebody is tests positive, we want to be able to contact all the people they've come into contact with and either have them isolate themselves immediately or at the very least have them come in for testing. And let's say, remember before we said maybe 20% of people are isolating themselves? Let's say we could catch half of all cases halfway through that contagious period. Maybe we could catch more cases, but it would take longer. I'm not sure. But if we could catch half of cases halfway through the contagious period, then we're getting rid of 25% of those contagious days. So 75% of R naught is left. And if I multiply all of this out, take all of these reductions, again, I just said this, but I want to repeat myself, all of which seem like sort of half measures that aren't going to get us very far. But all of them stacked together are enough to get our R naught value down below 1. With my set of numbers here, we've gotten down to 0.9. Yay, R naught is less than 1. That would mean that if we're able to keep this up, and this seems closer to something that we could sustain, although God, what it's going to mean about colleges and classes on college campuses, I don't know. If we can keep this up, we would see that disease gradually fading out. It's actually a little bit better than this because of the immunities in the population. If 10% of people have antibodies, that's probably high for the country as a whole, but I have seen estimates that suggest that New York City, it might be as high as 25% right now. And if 10% of people have antibodies, and R, that is, not just the R naught, but also taking into account the number of people those infections bounce off because they're immune, might be 0.8. And the lower it is, the faster that disease is going to die out. So this is the sort of stuff people look at when they're thinking about reducing and mitigating an epidemic, and these calculations and many much more sophisticated ones involving modeling that nevertheless fundamentally use these basic ideas, allow them to estimate the effect of a number of mitigation interventions, no one of which is sufficient by itself. So I have posted a link, as I think I said before, to a couple of other simulations if you're curious to look at them, and to a site which lets you play with different medications and their effect on R naught, in addition to selecting your own value for R naught and how things change over time, and see some of the sorts of models like people are creating out there. So that's really my take-home message for you, is that these are things people think about when they're trying to mitigate a disease. If you think about AIDS, what did people look at in AIDS? They looked at reducing the number of contacts that an infected person had by encouraging by basically trying to make sure people knew they were sick and encouraging them to have fewer sexual partners, less dangerous behavior, reducing the chance of the disease being transmitted from person to person through broader use of condoms, barrier methods, and these days some of the um, medicines that people can take, which will reduce their chance of spreading it, or if they are the healthy partner of somebody who is HIV positive, reduce their chance of catching it. We don't have techniques for reducing the number of days, or in the case of HIV, years that somebody is contagious with it. Although, again, we do know that reducing their viral load reduces the amount of the virus they're spreading. So it has an effect like that. So we think about these different approaches we can take to mitigating a disease and how combining them can get us somewhere that no one of them alone would be sufficient to do. I want to say that R naught less than 1 just means cases start to decrease, and there might still be a large number of cases. So that's why we're being very cautious at this point, or many of the states are. We don't want to back off shelter in place until cases are low, because if we overshoot and if R naught gets above 1, cases are going to start to pick up again. And if they start to pick up, you want them to start to pick up from a fairly small number of cases, not from already a fairly large number of cases out there. And the fact that these strategies stack can also be useful right now, even if we are still sheltering in place. For example, wearing masks whenever you're out in public, that's going to continue to reduce that R naught down below the current whatever it is, 0.9 or 0.8, and hopefully make that curve go down more quickly. So those are the sorts of things that people are looking at. I know in Germany, they have been talking about and have started to reduce a number of their shelter-in-place type orders. And there was some concern that R was creeping above 1. And they actually, I believe, went back and reinstituted some of the protections, but they had felt that the R value had gotten low enough that it was safe to start releasing the pressure. And as we saw through Flatten the Curve, another reason why we don't want to back off on shelter in place too early is, in addition to wanting the cases to get down low, we also want to build up hospital capacity so we can start treating things other than COVID. So those are the sorts of things people are looking at right now, but I do want to emphasize that there are paths out of this even before we have vaccines, and nobody knows how long vaccines are going to take. There was an excellent piece in the New York Times recently about the timing to vaccine, if you would like to look at that. But there are paths out of this that have many smaller changes instead of this one massive change, and even so are responsible and well thought out and can keep the cases of disease down. So with that, I want to say thank you. This has been a crazy and insane semester, and particularly a bizarre one to be teaching this topic. Good luck to you all. Congratulations on your graduation, and take care of yourself and your families.